Welcome to the Red Dice Diaries. This podcast is a rambling journey through the wonderful world of RPGs from the viewpoint of a long-time GM and player. The music at the start of this podcast was Nightmare by Alexander Nakarada and is used under Creative Commons license. In this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be starting off with a voicemail message that I received from Dr. Robert Groves. Thank you very much for getting in touch, Robert. And I'm going to turn over to him without any further ado.
Hey, John, this is Robert from the DM Dad podcast. I've been enjoying your discussions of the BX Essentials line. BX is one of my favorite versions of Dungeons and Dragons, so I'm thinking I'm going to have to check that out. But I was wondering, you mentioned some of the other retro clones and their unique flavor, and I wondered how you feel BX Essentials compares to the basic fantasy role-playing game by Chris Gonerman, because I that's also meant to be a derivative of BX, but it uses things like ascending armor class and stuff. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that rule system.
Thanks very much for getting in touch, Robert. And yes, I've also got the basic fantasy role-playing game by Chris Gonerman, although I think I'm like an edition behind the current one, although I've got the current one in PDF. Now, so flicking through them all, and I'm a fairly recent convert to sort of OSR gaming, so I'm certainly no expert when it comes to the differences between them. So feel free to take that as a disclaimer. But flicking through my copy of Basic Fantasy Role-Playing and BX Essentials, I would say that the main differences, as far as I can see, are that Basic Fantasy splits out class and race. In Basic Fantasy, you pick a class and you also pick a race, whereas BX Essentials goes for the race as class styling. So you either play a fighter or a dwarf or an elf. You don't play a dwarven fighter or an elven fighter. Now, this is just a matter of personal taste. I know that BX Essentials has tried to remain sort of true to the original BX, changing it as little as possible. And certainly I know that race as class was a big feature in BX. Some people like it, some people don't. Personally, I quite like it. However, I have no problems with Basic Fantasies splitting out of the races. The other main difference that I note is that Basic Fantasy has switched over to using an ascending armor class, whereas BX Essentials keeps the original THACO, or to hit armor class 0, of the original BX system. And again, this is really just a thing that comes down to personal preference. I know that myself, I don't really have any problems with THACO as such, although I do think that ascending armor class is a little more intuitive. But I think once you get used to either of them, they're both pretty easy to use. The only real other difference I can see between them is in the formatting. Basic Fantasy is a single book, certainly in the main rule book, and has a 2-column black and white layout with a smattering of artwork throughout it. Very nice, very clear, easy to understand, and pretty much everything you need is in this one core book. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. BX Essentials has split itself into a number of small booklets. Each of them are about sort of just shy of 50 pages long, whereas the entirety of Basic Fantasy fits into about 150 pages, if memory serves me correct. Now, BX Essentials, the sort of core line is going to be 5 books. So if you take it 50 pages, you're looking at about 250 pages there. So there is a bit more of a page count when it comes to BX Essentials. I presume that's probably because BX Essentials is in this sort of American digest format rather than being in the single book like Basic Fantasy. And again, it largely comes down to a matter of personal preference. I quite like the little booklets of BX Essentials, since I think if you're a player, you really only need the core rules book and the classes and equipment book. So you've only got two tiny little booklets to take with you to the game. And as I've said on a number of previous occasions, I am an unashamed fan of the American Digest size of books. I think it's very nice to have a pocket-sized book that you can easily carry around. And BX Essentials certainly ticks that box for me. Not that Basic Fantasy is a huge weighty tome that you'd have to lug about, but it is in a slightly larger format. The other thing I would say is that the layout in BX Essentials is a little more pleasing to the eye, using a sort of light green colour and accenting various bits of important information to help them stand out. Whereas the Basic Fantasy book, which is a great book, no doubt, has a monochrome layout. Again, personal preference, which you prefer. I certainly am glad that I've got both of these books, and I would have no difficulty in using stuff out of Basic Fantasy in BX Essentials or the other way around if I needed to. Yes, there'd be a small amount of conversion necessary for the armor classes, but it's basic mathematics. It's no real difficulty to do. So by and large, I think they're both pretty much the same rule set. BX Essentials has really tried to make sure it doesn't change anything from the original D&D BX rules, just reformatting it slightly and polishing it up a little where there have been contradictory rules, or maybe some things weren't quite as clear as they could have been in the older rule books. Whereas Basic Fantasy has taken exactly the same rules and the author has just tweaked them a little to improve it or alter it to suit their personal preferences, adding in the ascending armor class, separating out race and class, and changing the layout of the books and fitting them down into a nice A4 sized books. One of the real benefits of Basic Fantasy, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that a lot of people get involved in creating them. So it's sort of like a group effort. And also the fact that I think all of the PDFs for Basic Fantasy are available for free on the internet, which is obviously a great thing for anyone who is strapped for cash and wants to get a bit of D&D role-playing going on. Now, I'm sure there are probably a few other sort of subtle differences that I may have missed. As I say, I'm a recent convert to OSR, and I'm certainly no rules guru when it comes to that. But I hope I've at least answered your question in a meaningful way there, Robert. In terms of which one I'd go for if I was buying them, obviously I've got both of them, but I do like the BX Essentials mainly for the portability and the nice layout of it. So if I had the money, I'd probably go for BX Essentials, and I didn't mind the THACO. However, if you are a little bit strapped for cash, you just want one book that pretty much covers everything, or you prefer ascending armor class and separating out race and class, I'd probably advise you to take a look at Basic Fantasy first. And even if you do decide to go for BX, certainly have a look at Basic Fantasy. Like I say, the PDFs are available freely on the internet. There is no reason not to give that a look. So that's it for this episode. If you have any questions or suggestions for things you'd like to see in the podcast in future, please either email them to reddicediaries@gmail.com or drop me a voicemail at Anchor. Until I see you next time, wherever you're playing, take care and enjoy yourselves.